My name is Marcus Williams, and I'm going to tell you about the 2 years I spent in prison for a crime I didn't commit, and the 5 years after that I spent making sure the people who put me there understood what they'd done. This isn't a story about dramatic confrontations or violent retribution. It's about patience, about watching people destroy themselves with the same lies they used to destroy me, and about learning that sometimes the best revenge is simply letting the truth breathe. I was 24 when Detective Sarah Chun arrested me for armed robbery. I was working as a line cook at a restaurant in Portland, saving money to open my own place someday, living a completely ordinary life. Then one night, 3 uniformed officers showed up at my apartment at 2 in the morning, guns drawn, shouting for me to get on the ground. They said I'd robbed a convenience store at gunpoint 2 nights earlier, gotten away with $800, and traumatized a teenage clerk who was just trying to earn gas money. They had a witness who'd identified me from a photo lineup. They had security footage that showed someone my height and build. They had my supposed motive, that I was in debt and desperate. None of it was true. I'd been at work during the robbery, had 15 people who could verify it, had clock-in records and security footage from the restaurant. But Detective Chun had already decided I was guilty, had already built her case, had already convinced the prosecutor that I was a dangerous criminal who needed to be locked up. My public defender was overworked and underpaid, handling 70 cases simultaneously. He told me to take a plea deal, that fighting it would mean years of pretrial detention, that even with an alibi, juries tend to believe cops over defendants. He said if I pleaded guilty to a lesser charge, I'd get 2 years instead of 10. I refused. I wanted to fight, wanted to prove my innocence, wanted to clear my name completely. My lawyer looked at me with tired eyes and said that was my right, but I should prepare for disappointment. The trial lasted 3 days. The prosecution's star witness was a man named Kevin Palmer who'd been in the parking lot during the robbery. He testified that he'd gotten a clear look at the robber's face, that he was absolutely certain it was me. Under cross-examination, he admitted he'd been 50 feet away at night, that the whole encounter lasted maybe 30 seconds, that he'd initially told police he wasn't sure he could identify anyone. But Detective Chun had worked with him, had shown him photos, had helped him remember details. By the time he testified, Kevin was confident, definitive, unshakable in his identification. My alibi was solid. My manager testified I'd been working. Co-workers confirmed it. Time cards proved it. But the prosecutors suggested the time cards could have been falsified, that my co-workers were lying to protect me, that the security footage was inconclusive. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They came back with a guilty verdict on all counts. The judge sentenced me to 5 years in state prison. 5 years for a crime I didn't commit, for a robbery I had nothing to do with, because one witness was certain and a detective was convinced and a jury believed them both. I sat in that courtroom listening to the sentence and felt something inside me go very quiet and very cold. Not rage, not yet. Just a kind of crystalline clarity about what had been done to me and what I would eventually do in return. Prison was exactly as bad as you'd imagine and worse in ways you wouldn't. The violence, the noise, the constant awareness that you're surrounded by people who've done terrible things. But worse than any of that was the injustice, the knowledge that I was there for no reason, that my life had been stolen by people who were supposed to seek truth and instead had settled for convenience. I spent my first 6 months angry, fighting the system, filing appeals that went nowhere. Then I realized anger was just making my time harder. So I got strategic instead. I started researching. The prison library was limited but had law books, old computers with restricted internet access, resources for inmates pursuing appeals. I learned about wrongful convictions, about eyewitness misidentification, about detective misconduct. I read hundreds of cases, looking for patterns, looking for strategies. And I learned about Detective Sarah Chun. She'd been with Portland police for 12 years, had an impressive clearance rate, was known for closing cases quickly. She'd been promoted twice, was being considered for sergeant. She was ambitious, driven, effective. She was also sloppy. I found 3 other cases she'd worked where defendants had later been exonerated. In each case, the pattern was similar: a confident eyewitness, a quick arrest, a conviction that later fell apart when new evidence emerged. In one case, DNA proved the defendant's innocence. In another, the real perpetrator confessed to a different crime and mentioned this one too. In the third, Security footage from a different angle finally proved the alibi the detective had dismissed. Detective Chen wasn't intentionally framing innocent people. She was just so convinced of her own judgment that she ignored evidence that contradicted her initial theory. She found a suspect who seemed right, then built a case around that certainty, dismissing anything that didn't fit. She was a true believer in her own infallibility, and that would be her weakness. I started writing letters. Not to lawyers or advocacy groups, though I did that too, but to journalists, to civil rights organizations, to anyone who might be interested in a pattern of wrongful convictions connected to one detective. Most ignored me. I was just another inmate claiming innocence, and everyone in prison claims innocence. But one journalist, a woman named Rebecca Torres who covered criminal justice issues for a local alt-weekly paper, wrote back. She was skeptical but interested. She'd covered one of the other exonerations and remembered Detective Chen's name from that case. If you can provide documentation, she wrote, I'll look into it. But I need more than your word. I need evidence. I had 2 years of research. I sent her everything, case files I'd requested through Discovery, news articles about the exonerations, analysis of the patterns. I laid it out methodically, showed her the timeline, explained how Detective Chen's methods created systematic risk of wrongful conviction. Rebecca started investigating. It took her 8 months, but she was thorough. She interviewed the other exonerated defendants, reviewed case files, talked to defense attorneys and prosecutors. She filed public records requests for Detective Chen's arrest and conviction rates. What she found was damning. Detective Chen had an 87% conviction rate, far higher than average. But she also had a questionable pattern. Quick arrests based on limited evidence, heavy reliance on eyewitness testimony, resistance to alternative theories or suspects. Rebecca's article ran 18 months into my sentence. It was titled The Detective Who Never Doubts: How Certainty in Law Enforcement Can Lead to Wrongful Convictions. It didn't explicitly accuse Detective Chen of misconduct, but it laid out the pattern clearly, showed how her approach to investigations created systemic problems. The article got attention. Other journalists picked it up. Civil rights groups started reviewing her cases. The police department launched an internal investigation, more to protect themselves than to seek truth, but still, an investigation. And then something unexpected happened. Kevin Palmer, the witness who'd identified me, came forward and recanted. He said he'd never been certain. He said Detective Chen had shown him photos repeatedly, had asked leading questions, had made it clear she believed I was guilty. He said over time, he'd convinced himself he was sure, had built confidence through repetition rather than actual memory. He said he'd been living with guilt ever since the trial, knowing his testimony had put a man in prison, but unsure if he could trust his own recollection. Rebecca's article had given him permission to admit his doubts. My conviction was overturned. I was released after serving 2 years and 3 months of a 5-year sentence. The prosecutor's office issued a careful statement about how the system worked as intended, how new evidence had been considered and justice ultimately served. They didn't apologize. They didn't admit fault. They just moved on. But I couldn't move on. I'd lost 2 years of my life, my job, my apartment, my savings paying for commissary and phone calls. I'd been labeled a violent criminal, had that on my record until the expungement finally went through. I'd been brutalized in prison, had seen things and experienced things that would wake me up screaming for years. And the people responsible, Detective Chen, the prosecutor who'd pursued the case despite a solid alibi, they faced no consequences. Detective Chen was reassigned to different duties pending the internal investigation, but she kept her job, kept her salary, kept her pension. That's when I decided I wasn't done. I didn't want to hurt Detective Chen physically. I'm not violent, despite what she'd convinced a jury I was. But I wanted her to understand what she'd done, wanted her to face real consequences, wanted to ensure she couldn't do this to anyone else. I started by filing a lawsuit. Wrongful conviction suits are hard to win. Qualified immunity protects police from most liability, and proving intentional misconduct is nearly impossible. But I had something most wrongful conviction victims don't have, a clear pattern, documented by a journalist, that showed this wasn't an isolated mistake, but systematic negligence. My lawyer, a civil rights attorney who took my case pro bono, was honest about our chances. We might settle for a small amount, she said. The city won't want this in court. But don't expect justice, expect pragmatism. The city offered me $25,000 to go away quietly. My lawyer advised me to take it. That going to trial could mean getting nothing. I refused. I wanted my day in court. I wanted Detective Chun on the stand. I wanted her to have to answer questions about her methods, her certainty, her carelessness. The trial took 2 years to reach court. In that time, I rebuilt my life slowly and carefully. I couldn't work in restaurants anymore. The background check stigma lingered even after expungement. So I started doing freelance work, writing about criminal justice, sharing my story with advocacy groups, helping other wrongful conviction victims navigate the system. I also kept researching Detective Chun. Not obsessively, just methodically. I tracked her cases, looked for patterns, documented everything. I found 2 more questionable convictions that were now under review. I found complaints from defense attorneys about her interrogation techniques. I found a whole structure of carelessness hidden behind impressive statistics. When the civil trial finally happened, Detective Chin testified for 3 days. She was defensive, insistent that she'd followed proper procedures, that any mistakes were honest errors. She refused to acknowledge the pattern, refused to see herself as anything but a dedicated officer doing difficult work. My lawyer was brilliant. She walked Detective Chun through case after case, showed how the same problems kept appearing, made it clear this wasn't about one mistake, but about a fundamental approach that prioritized conviction over truth. The jury awarded me $1.2 million. Not from Detective Chin personally, qualified immunity protected her, but from the city for inadequate training and supervision. It was a huge verdict, one of the largest for a wrongful conviction in state history. The city appealed, of course. We settled eventually for $750,000, still a substantial amount. But more important than the money was what the verdict represented. Public acknowledgement that what happened to me was wrong, that the system had failed, that Detective Chin's methods were flawed. The internal investigation concluded a month after the civil verdict. Detective Chun was demoted, lost her detective status, was reassigned to desk duty. She appealed through the police union, but lost. 6 months later, she resigned. I should have felt satisfied. I'd exposed her pattern, prevented her from investigating cases, gotten financial compensation, even forced her out of the job. But I still felt empty. Because Detective Chin still didn't understand. She'd given interviews painting herself as a victim of political correctness, claiming she was being punished for being effective, insisting she'd done nothing wrong. She genuinely believed she was innocent, just as she genuinely believed I was guilty. And that lack of awareness, that inability to see her own fallibility, meant she'd learned nothing. So I did something that surprised even me. I reached out to her directly. We met at a coffee shop, neutral territory. She was suspicious, angry, defensive. "What do you want?" she asked immediately. "I want you to understand what you did to me. I investigated a crime. The witness identified you. The jury convicted you. I did my job. Your job is to find the truth, not to confirm your assumptions. I followed the evidence. You followed the evidence that supported what you'd already decided. You ignored the evidence that contradicted it. I pulled out a folder, documents I'd compiled. You showed Kevin Palmer my photos 6 times before he was certain. You know that repeated exposure creates false confidence, but you did it anyway. You dismissed my alibi without seriously investigating it. You built a case around certainty instead of building certainty from the case. Hindsight is easy. This isn't hindsight. Other defendants told you the same things before they were exonerated. Defense attorneys raised the same concerns. You had a pattern, and you ignored it because acknowledging it would mean admitting you make mistakes. Detective Chun was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You think you're better than me? You think you understand the job? I deal with real criminals every day. People who hurt others, who destroy lives. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts. And when your instincts are wrong, innocent people go to prison. I put away hundreds of guilty people, and at least 4 innocent ones that we know of. How many more are there that we haven't found yet?" She flinched at that. For the first time, I saw doubt in her eyes. Real doubt, not the defensive certainty she'd worn like armor. "I want you to do something," I said. "I want you to review every case you worked. Not to admit wrongdoing, not for legal purposes. Just for yourself. Look at them with the knowledge that you can be wrong, that certainty isn't the same as truth. See if there are others like me." Why would I do that? Because you became a cop to help people, didn't you? To protect and serve. If innocent people are in prison because of your cases, you're not helping. You're causing the exact harm you swore to prevent. Detective Chin stood up. This conversation is over. She left. I didn't know if my words had any impact. I didn't know if she'd actually review her cases or if she'd continue insisting she'd done nothing wrong. But 3 months later, I got a call from my civil rights attorney. "You're not going to believe this," she said. Detective Chin just testified in a post-conviction hearing. For the defense, she admitted there were problems with her investigation, that she'd been too certain that the conviction might be unsound. The defendant in that case was later exonerated. DNA evidence confirmed what Detective Chin's testimony had opened the door to investigating. She called me a week after that testimony. "I reviewed my cases," she said without preamble. "You were right. There are problems. I found 3 more that need further investigation. I've contacted the Innocence Project, provided them with everything I have. Why are you telling me this? Because you asked me to understand what I did. And I'm trying. It doesn't undo the harm. It doesn't give you back those 2 years. But I'm trying to make sure I don't cause more harm going forward. That's all I wanted," I said. "Not revenge, just recognition. Just an acknowledgement that you can be wrong, that your certainty nearly destroyed my life." "I was wrong," she said quietly. "About you, about the others. I was so sure I was right that I stopped questioning. That's on me." We talked for an hour. She told me about her career, about the pressure to clear cases, about the metrics that rewarded speed over accuracy. She told me about her own trauma, cases where she'd arrived too late, victims she couldn't help. She'd built her identity around never failing, and that fear of failure had made her blind to her actual failures. "What will you do now?" I asked. "I don't know. I can't be a detective anymore. But maybe I can teach, help new officers understand the risks of certainty, the importance of doubt. Maybe I can work with wrongful conviction groups, help review cases." "That would be meaningful," I said. "It won't fix what I did to you." "No, but it might prevent future wrongs." "That's worth something." 4 years after my release, I published a book about my experience. It wasn't angry or bitter, just honest. I told my story, but I also told Detective Chin's story, tried to explain how good people with good intentions can still cause terrible harm. I talked about systematic problems in law enforcement, about the pressures that lead to shortcuts, about the metrics that incentivize convictions over truth. The book did well, became required reading in some criminal justice programs. I started speaking at police academies, sharing my perspective, helping officers understand the impact of their work from the other side. Detective Chun came to one of my talks. She sat in the back, didn't ask any questions, just listened. Afterward, she approached me. "Thank you," she said, "for not making me the villain of your story, for trying to explain instead of just condemn. You made yourself the villain by refusing to question your certainty. But you're rewriting that story now. That counts for something." She nodded. "I'm working with the Innocence Project now. We've identified 2 more cases that need review. Both convictions I was involved in. Both may be wrongful. How does that feel?" "Terrible. Like I'm uncovering my own grave. But necessary." She paused. "I've been going to therapy, trying to understand why I was so resistant to doubt. My therapist thinks it's about control, about needing to be right because admitting error feels like admitting incompetence. And what do you think? I think I was scared. Scared that if I admitted I could be wrong about one thing, it meant I could be wrong about everything. So I doubled down on certainty, made it armor against doubt. But that armor imprisoned me just like my certainty imprisoned you." 5 years after my release, the prosecutor who tried my case was running for district attorney. During the campaign, my case came up repeatedly. His opponent used it to paint him as overly aggressive, willing to pursue convictions despite exculpatory evidence. The prosecutor, Michael Davidson, initially defended his actions. He said he'd relied on the detective's investigation, on the witness testimony, on the jury's verdict. He said prosecutors have to trust the system. But as the campaign continued and the criticism mounted, something shifted. During a debate, he was asked directly about my case, about whether he'd pursued it too aggressively, whether he'd ignored my alibi. He could have deflected, could have blamed the detective or the witness. Instead, he said something unexpected. "Yes, I should have looked harder at the alibi. I should have questioned the witness identification more thoroughly. I was young, ambitious, and I wanted the conviction. That was wrong." Mr. Williams spent 2 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, and I played a role in that. I can't change what happened, but I can learn from it. If elected, I'll implement conviction integrity units, create better standards for eyewitness identification, and prioritize truth over statistics. He lost the election anyway. The damage to his reputation was too severe. But his concession meant something to me. Another person understanding what they'd done, another brick in the foundation of accountability. 6 years after my release, Kevin Palmer, the witness whose identification had convicted me, asked to meet. We sat in the same coffee shop where I'd met with Detective Chun. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to hear it. I destroyed your life because I convinced myself I was sure when I wasn't. I let myself be led by the detective. I wanted to be helpful, wanted to solve the crime, and I let that desire override my actual memory. Why come forward now?" I asked. "Because I saw you on TV, talking about your book, and I realized I've been living with this guilt for 8 years. I testified at your trial, looked you in the eye, swore I was certain. I sent you to prison with my certainty. And I was wrong. You were manipulated," I said. Detective Chun used techniques that are known to create false confidence. "It's not entirely your fault. But I could have said I wasn't sure. I could have admitted doubt. Instead, I performed certainty because that's what everyone wanted. The detective wanted it. The prosecutor wanted it. Even I wanted it because being sure felt better than being uncertain." We talked for a long time. Kevin told me about his own struggles since the trial, about the nightmares, about the therapy, about how he'd questioned every memory and perception, wondering what else he'd been wrong about. "You helped get me out," I reminded him. "You recanted. That took courage. It took 8 years too long. But you did it. Some people never admit they were wrong." "How do you not hate me?" he asked. "I destroyed your life." I thought about that carefully. I did hate you for a long time. But hate is exhausting. And I realized eventually that you were a victim too, in a different way. You were manipulated by a system that values certainty over truth. That's not an excuse, but it's context. 7 years after my release, I started a nonprofit focused on reforming eyewitness identification procedures. We worked with police departments to implement best practices, trained officers on the risks of suggestive procedures, helped jurisdictions adopt sequential lineups, and blind administration. It was slow work, frustrating work. Change in law enforcement comes incrementally, resisted by people who insist the old ways work fine. But gradually, we made progress. A few departments adopted our recommendations. Those departments saw decreases in wrongful identifications. Detective Chun joined our advisory board. Her presence was controversial. Some people saw her as exactly the problem we were trying to solve. But I argued for including her, said that people who'd made mistakes and learned from them had valuable perspectives. "She knows what goes wrong from the inside," I told our board. "She can help us understand the pressures, the rationalizations, the shortcuts. She's valuable precisely because she made these mistakes." It helped that Chun was genuinely committed to reform now. She spoke candidly about her failures, didn't excuse them, but explained them. She became an effective advocate because she could talk to police officers as one of them, could explain reforms in language they understood. 8 years after my release, I got married. My wife, Rachel, was an attorney who'd worked on criminal justice reform long before meeting me. She understood my obsession with the case, my need to turn trauma into purpose, my complicated feelings about revenge and justice. "You got your revenge," she told me during our honeymoon. "Not the revenge you initially wanted, which was just to hurt the people who hurt you. But better revenge, you changed the system that enabled them. You turned your experience into something that protects others. It doesn't feel like revenge," I admitted. "It feels like repair. Maybe that's what healthy revenge looks like. Not destruction, but reconstruction." 9 years after my release, the last of the questionable convictions linked to Detective Chun was overturned. 5 innocent people total had been exonerated, their lives partially restored, though the years they'd lost could never be returned. The police department implemented major reforms: mandatory recording of witness interviews, blind lineup administration, conviction integrity units to review questionable cases. Detective Chin's pattern had exposed systematic problems, and the department had finally addressed them. I attended the press conference where the chief announced the reforms. He didn't mention me by name. didn't acknowledge that it had taken my wrongful conviction and years of advocacy to force these changes. That was fine. I wasn't doing this for recognition. After the press conference, the chief approached me privately. "I know you think we didn't do enough," he said. "That we resisted too long. That we protected Detective Chun when we should have held her accountable." "You did resist too long," I agreed. "But you're implementing reforms now. That's what matters. Your lawsuit cost the city significant money. These reforms are expensive to implement. There are people who think you're the problem, that you've made policing harder. Good policing should be hard. It should require thought, doubt, care. Easy policing is what put me in prison." He nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry for what happened to you. And I'm grateful, though I couldn't say this publicly, that you pushed us to be better." 10 years after my conviction, I stood in front of a crowd at a criminal justice reform conference. I'd been asked to give the keynote address, to talk about my experience and what it taught me about revenge and justice and change. When I was released from prison, I told them, I wanted revenge. I wanted Detective Chun to suffer, wanted the prosecutor to lose his career, wanted everyone who'd played a role in my wrongful conviction to feel even a fraction of the pain I'd experienced. And in some ways, I got that revenge. Detective Chun lost her career. The prosecutor lost an election. Their reputations were damaged. But that revenge didn't satisfy me the way I'd imagined. It felt hollow, incomplete. What did satisfy me was watching them change. Seeing Detective Chun recognize her mistakes and work to prevent future ones. Hearing the prosecutor acknowledge his errors and promise reform. Watching the system that failed me slowly, grudgingly improve. That's not the revenge of movies, dramatic and final. It's the revenge of reality, slow and complicated and never quite complete. But it's also more meaningful because it's not just about punishing people who harmed me. It's about preventing harm to others. If there's a lesson in my story, it's this. The best revenge isn't destruction, it's transformation. Not just of yourself, though that's important, but of the systems that enabled the harm. Turn your pain into policy. Turn your experience into expertise. Turn your rage into reform. That's harder than simple revenge. It takes longer, requires more patience, demands that you engage with people who harmed you rather than just destroying them. But it's also more lasting, more meaningful, more just. I looked out at the audience, saw formerly incarcerated people and criminal justice reformers, saw police officers and prosecutors who'd come to learn. I saw Detective Chun sitting in the third row, taking notes. I saw Kevin Palmer near the back, tears on his face. I spent 2 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit, I continued. That's time I'll never get back, experiences I can't undo. The people who put me there have apologized, have changed, have worked to make amends. But apologies don't return stolen years. So why do I work with them? Why do I include Detective Chun in my nonprofit? Why do I speak at police academies? Why do I try to change the system rather than just condemn it? Because condemnation is easy and change is hard. Because rage feels good, but reform helps people. Because I can choose to let my wrongful conviction define me as a victim, or I can let my response to it define me as an advocate. I chose advocacy. I chose reform. I chose to turn the worst experience of my life into something that might prevent similar experiences for others. That's not forgiveness, exactly. I haven't forgotten what was done to me, haven't absolved anyone of responsibility. But I've moved past the need for punishment to a focus on prevention. And that, I've learned, is what sustainable revenge looks like. Not a moment of destruction, but years of construction. Not tearing down the people who harmed you, but building systems that prevent future harm. It's not emotionally satisfying in the way we imagine revenge should be, but it's intellectually satisfying, morally satisfying, practically satisfying. And 10 years later, that's enough. The audience applauded. I left the stage and found Detective Chun waiting in the hallway. "Thank you," she said, "for giving me a chance to be better than I was." "You gave yourself that chance," I replied. "You could have stayed defensive, insisted you did nothing wrong. Instead, you looked honestly at your mistakes. That took courage. It took having no choice. You forced me to see what I'd done. I showed you the mirror. You chose to look." We stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Chun said, "I'll never stop being sorry for what I did to you. But I'm grateful for what it taught me." "That sounds selfish, finding gratitude in your suffering." "It's not selfish if you use those lessons to help others," I said. Your testimony has helped exonerate people. Your work has improved police practices. Your mistakes became warnings that prevented future mistakes. Does that balance the scales? No, but it tilts them closer to level. And that's all we can really do. Keep tilting the scales until they're as balanced as we can make them. 11 years after my wrongful conviction, I received a letter from a man who'd been recently exonerated after serving 12 years for a murder he didn't commit. He'd read my book, attended one of my talks, been inspired to turn his own experience into advocacy. You showed me that wrongful conviction doesn't have to be the end of your story, he wrote. It can be the beginning of a different story, one about resilience and reform. Thank you for that. I kept that letter on my desk, read it whenever I felt discouraged by slow progress or resistant systems. It reminded me why the work mattered, why choosing reform over revenge had been the right path. Because revenge, I'd learned, isn't about making bad people suffer. It's about making sure their badness doesn't continue causing harm. And sometimes that requires working with them, teaching them, helping them become better. It's not the revenge of movies, but it's the revenge that actually changes things. And 12 years after a detective's certainty nearly destroyed my life, I could say that I'd moved beyond both the crime and the revenge. I was no longer defined by what was done to me, but by what I'd built in response. That was the final victory, more complete than any punishment could have been. And it was enough.